Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday morning Overberg Group Geosciences presentation. We'd like to welcome Professor Jonah Choiniere this morning, and if my pronunciation is wrong, it should actually be French, he tells us. His background, history, and family is French. Jonah holds a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology, a Bachelor of Science in Geology from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and a PhD in Biology from the George Washington University. He is currently Professor of Comparative Paleobiology at the Evolutionary Studies Institute of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and spent his early career excavating Cretaceous dinosaurs in China and Mongolia. Since moving to South Africa in 2012, he has been focusing on the transitions in terrestrial ecosystems across the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. His current research focuses on the biostratigraphy of Archosauria, dinosaurs, and crocodilians in the Elliott Formation, on their functional anatomy, and on the use of CT scanning to get new information on old fossils. So welcome, Jonah, and we really look forward to the presentation and then equally the discussion and interaction afterwards.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to tell you guys today about the research I've done really since I started at WITS over 9 years ago now. Boy, it's been a long time. And that research, as you said, it focuses really on End Triassic Extinction and the rise of dinosaurs in South Africa's Elliott Formation. Without further ado, I'd like to take you sort of back 200 million years ago to the end of the Triassic period. And at that time, obviously, the Earth was a very different place. There's no polar ice caps, and all the continents are still glued together in the center of the globe in the vast supercontinent that we all know as Pangaea. Well, it's just amazing for me to think about this because, you could have walked at that time from Johannesburg to almost any world capital you would have liked to Buenos Aires, up to where I'm from in Massachusetts in the US. And South Africa at that time is tucked away sort of quite far south relative to its current position, nearly 50 degrees south and far from its current position relative to the equator. Now, the landscape of that Triassic South Africa was also very different from modern times. And you will know that the biggest mountains are far to the south. They're sort of the great grandparents of today's Cape Fold Belt, and they would have been much taller at that time. And away to the north towards Johannesburg and inland southern Africa stretched the vast low-lying Karoo Basin. So rivers are running off of these mountains, meandering through the landscape, drying, flooding, but constantly weathering those mountains into dirt and piling that dirt up layer on layer into the body of Africa. Now, by the time we get to the late Triassic, the rush of sediment had slowed somewhat from sort of Bruce Rubige's Beaufort times, but we still had infilling of the Great Karoo Basin. And you can see that if you take a cleaver and sort of cut the country from southwest to northeast, well, actually, as Bruce has done in this image on the bottom here, you can see that the sediments that end up being stacked right on top of the Beaufort group in the Triassic and into the Jurassic form today what's marked in yellow here in what we call the Elliott Formation. So today, the remnants of the Elliott Formation, it's been eroded considerably. These remnants form the low hills that lead up to the Drakensberg, and they stretch from Clarence in the far north of this map, and all the Elliott exposure here is marked in sort of a bright orange color, all the way down past the town of Elliott itself in the south. And the Elliott Formation still covers more than 2,000 square kilometers of South Africa in Lesotho. Unfortunately, that erosion stripped much of the former extent of the Elliott Formation, and what's left really sort of surrounds the Drakensberg and Lesotho almost like a distorted bullseye. And that means that the best Elliott exposures really in South Africa are in the eastern part of the Free State, northern parts of the Eastern Cape, and really tucked into the Drakensberg in northwestern KZN. These remnants, inspirationally for me, are sort of the parts of the country that I like best. I mean, they form these iconic, stunning, dramatic landscapes like this view in Golden Gate Highlands National Park that I'm showing you now. And they're just a tremendous place to work. And I'm so lucky that I get to tread these areas. As you geologists know, each layer of those sediments represents sort of a short time, sort of a season or a year or a day during the Triassic or Jurassic. And if we can take a single layer out of the Elliott, we know that that single layer really represents a paleo landscape where animals were happily living and munching plants in each other, and that, their bones become trapped in those sediments and eventually turn to stone. Almost everywhere you look in the Elliott today, you can just take me almost anywhere in the Elliott, you'll find the fossil evidence of that ancient biodiversity. And so, while these vistas are sort of a happy place for us because we find fossils there and because we go to these mountains to relax, they also carry a sort of a remarkable drama of disaster and ecosystem collapse. And somewhere in the Elliott Formation, we know that something really bad happened. The Earth suffers a catastrophic mass extinction at the end of the Triassic period. And at that time, approximately this layer I've identified here, about 75% of Earth species disappear forever. That End Triassic Extinction, as we call it, is really linked to the opening of the Atlantic Ocean and the long, messy divorce between the continents that lead to their modern configuration. And so we see about 200 million years ago, the beginnings, the onset of the deposition of what are called the camp basalts, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And those basalts, in an incredibly short time, dumped something like 3 million cubic kilometers of lava out on Earth's surface. That extent of that lava is projected to have covered 11 million square kilometers. And if you go to New York and you're looking back across the Hudson River, you can see those lavas where they're columnar jointing. You can also see them in northeastern South America and in the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco, and also in parts of southern Europe. And so this is a tremendous amount of molten rock. And obviously with this sort of rifting, you get the emission of greenhouse gases, disruptions in oceanic geochemistry, and those result in changes of climate. And it's those changes in climate that really knock off 75% of Earth's species. That rifting, of course, we know is still active today. And I mean, this picture is from Iceland. And that you can see just what devastation those volcanic eruptions wreak on the Icelandic landscape. So it must have been something to behold. This is a figure from a National Geographic article. It came out a long time ago now, and it really nicely summarizes the effects of that mass extinction. So reptiles, in sort of a loose sense, diversify rapidly during the Triassic, and they evolve many, many different forms, including the ancestors of dinosaurs, as well as the ancestors of crocs, and a whole bunch of other things that aren't alive today, such as ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs and rhynchosaurs, and lastly, also the ancestors of today's snakes and lizards. Those animals are everywhere during the Triassic, and they're really just generating new diversity really quite rapidly. But something happens at that Triassic-Jurassic boundary, and many of those animals just cannot pass through. It sort of forms a barrier. And many of the early relatives of crocs and some of these other reptile species, they disappear forever. And what happens is dinosaurs persist. And by some good fortune, they go on to inherit the Earth. And they do a fantastic job of that in the next sort of 150 million years. And of course, today, birds are dinosaurs, and there's more species of birds than almost any other vertebrate life form on Earth. We call it now the age of the mammals, but it's really still the age of the dinosaurs. Another way to look at that mass extinction event might be to sort of look at the different types of animals that live in the Triassic and then in the Jurassic. The Triassic is just wonderful. It is just so weird, and it's sort of anyone's game. And so to me, there's no other time in Earth's history when you can evolve such strange features and still live to tell about it. And so if we look at Triassic animals, as I've shown you here on the left, we have things with sailbacks. We have things that almost look like a reptile cat. We've got horned lizard-like animals that are the size of a sort of eland today. We've got animals with armor all the way down their back. We've got giant tusked dicynodonts. We've got things at the bottom. This is a phytosaur. It looks like a croc, but it's not a croc, and it's not even necessarily on the line that leads to crocs. And so all these animals are prowling around in the Triassic, and then suddenly we hit this End Triassic extinction barrier, and what's left? A bunch of, well, quite boring, at least in body form sense, a bunch of boring Jurassic dinosaurs. And so this End Triassic Extinction event not only wipes out 75% of Earth's biodiversity, but it also wipes out like all these wild and woolly forms of vertebrate life that just don't persist. So the wonderful thing about studying the Elliott Formation is it documents that shift in faunas marvelously. It's one of the only places on the globe where we have a continuous record of deposition that extends from the late Triassic into the Jurassic with the extinction, of course, in between. This figure here, I can honestly tell you, more or less summarizes what I've managed to do in the last 9 years. It's a paper I published with Emma Shabordi, who many of you will know quite well, in 2020. But it actually summarizes sort of the research of about 150 years of fossil prospecting in the Elliott Formation, involving sort of dozens of faculty and postdocs and PhD students, both historical and present. So I want to walk you quickly through this figure and show you kind of what it tells us about the research prospectus for the Elliott moving forward. So on the left, of course, we've got the most recent geologic timescale, and with blue documenting the ages of the lower Jurassic, and purple documenting the ages of the upper Triassic. I've drawn a red line here between the two of them that denotes the End Triassic Extinction. And the next column over, next to this geologic timescale, are a series of radiometric dates that we've obtained from detrital zircons and the occasional tuff that we found in the Elliott Formation. And that work has taken 9 years of prospecting and, of course, trying to run some of these samples through various labs around the world. And so what's nice about this is that the ages that people have hypothesized for the Elliott largely match with those radiometric age assessments. We have pretty good evidence that, in fact, the Elliott temporally as well as biostratigraphically matches the Triassic into Jurassic timescale. But the most important column here in the center just gives you an overview of the diversity of fossil species in the two parts of the Elliott Formation, the lower part, which is Triassic, and the upper part, which is Jurassic. And if you simply look at the density of the silhouettes that I'm showing you, you get the main picture. There's really very little fossil sample in the Triassic part of the column, and there's a tremendous diversity of fossil animals in the Jurassic part of the column. And you can look at the Elliott collections records, which we've assembled from around the globe, and it paints that picture just as well. There's about 275 fossil specimens from the lower Elliott Formation, from the Triassic part of the sequence, and nearly 1,000 from the upper part. And so that means that the lower Elliott is about 1/4 as well sampled as the upper. And that's the main issue here. And so if we look out at a beautiful stack of Elliott sediments like this, this has just a bit too much greenery for me, but it's pretty good. The work ahead of us is really clear. To understand that End Triassic Extinction, we need to prospect the Triassic part of the lower Elliott to find more animals, to really increase that sampling so it's equal to the Jurassic part of the column. We need to figure out where in that stratigraphy the End Triassic Extinction event sits, with a bunch of radiometric dating and biostratigraphy. And lastly, we need to take that well-sampled Jurassic part of the upper Elliott Formation and understand what animals are doing. How are they able to survive this extinction? How do some lineages pass right through it unscathed like dinosaurs? And why do some other lineages, like these early relatives of crocs, go extinct? And so, my research now really focuses on searching that stack and trying to find the answers to these questions. And in the rest of my talk, I'm just going to tell you about a few advances we've made towards both of those goals. And I just want you guys to remember that the research achievements that I'm going to show you, they're really the hard work of the men and women in my research group. And so while I manage the overall goal, our productivity has been driven by many students and postdocs and, of course, other faculty around South Africa and around the world over the years. So this is a team effort, people, and it's wise to remember that. Let's cover the first part of the problem here, and that is just simply finding more fossils in the Triassic part of the column. There is so much beautiful outcrop in the lower Elliott. And much of it represents sort of abundant floodplain habitat. And it should be ideal for preserving fossils. I mean, these are rich areas. They should be teeming with life. But for some reason, prospecting the lower Elliott has been much harder than it should be. We have relatively few samples, as I've said, and you can go sort of meters and meters in lower Elliott exposures and find nothing. So where are the animals? Well, in many ways, the discovery of these lower Elliott things is simply because I've been able to stand on the shoulders of giants. And research in the lower Elliott actually started as early as the mid-1800s with people like H Brown finding fossils in the Alawal North area. I'll tell you more about him in a second. And another guy named Joseph Orpen, who collected fossils in South Africa and sent them to Sir Richard Owen at the British Museum at that time. And that prospecting carried on through to James Kitching, who is, of course, at the BPI. And that's my sort of academic heritage that I walked into at WITS. And now I'm continuing on, as the star calls me, WITS man, trying to uncover more of these secrets of the Elliott. One of the first things that I started doing at WITS when I began there was to assemble all of the Stormberg records, primarily Elliott fossils, into a single biostratigraphic database. And that work was carried on by my postdoc, Pia Viglietti. Well over 200 of them are the result of the work we've done the last 9 years. And that biostratigraphic database really allows us to see where the best lower Elliott exposures have been historically and today, and gives us new areas to prospect. This Stormberg biostratigraphic database, which we've been able to assemble, documents every single fossil known worldwide, that is in all museums, including places like the British Museum, collected in the Stormberg group, largely in the Elliott Formation. And so at least a couple hundred of these localities are things that we've found in the last 9 years. So if we look at that biostratigraphic database, one of the things that we find is that our knowledge of some lower Elliott fossils is surprisingly old. In fact, the first fossil dinosaurs from the lower Elliott Formation were collected in the mid-1800s from the Alawal North area, and they were described by no other than Thomas Henry Huxley, who's well known as Darwin's bulldog. So Huxley had a really keen interest in dinosaurs. For example, he worked on Archaeopteryx and realized that it was a link between birds and dinosaurs not long after he published this paper. And he described the genus Skeleodontoides from fossils sent to him from that Alawal North area. Many of you guys will know now that Skeleodontosaurus is kind of we don't talk about Skeleodontosaurus. It's a nomen dubium now. That is, it doesn't really have enough differences from other animals that we have to be confident it's a species. But recently we've been reviewing the material that Huxley described, some of which is in the South African Museum, and we find that at least some of it is different enough to be confident that it can be referred to this species called Melanorosaurus. And so Melanorosaurus, which was once Skeleodontosaurus, is one of our oldest and sort of best anchor species in the lower Elliott. More progress has come from looking at ancient fossil collections as well. This guy here on the upper left, Alfred H Brown, as I said, worked in Alawal North in the 1860s. And Brown used to sell fossils. He sold some to the British Museum, but he kind of soured on that relationship. And in the 1870s, he sold 2 crates of fossils to the Imperial Museum of Natural History in Vienna. Recently, one of my colleagues, Christian Kammerer, went to Vienna and began to sort out some of those crates, many of which were completely unprepared still. And he found that in addition to sort of dinosaur specimens, some of the fossils that Brown had shipped belonged to a large tusked mammal relative called a Dicynodont. And based on that material, he described a new species called Pentosaurus hoha'i. Now, Pentosaurus is the first Dicynodont ever described from the Elliott Formation. And it is one of these weird Triassic animals that's around in other global deposits in the Triassic, but which go extinct by the time we get to early Jurassic times. So this Pentosaurus hoha'i animal is good confirmation that the lower part of the Elliott actually does bear a typical Triassic fauna. Within my lab, we recently reviewed historically collected fossils in the South African Museum and at WITS. And these fossils include a bunch of teeth, like this sort of giant predatory teeth with sharp teeth with serrations on them, and jaws containing such teeth that were sort of discovered as fragments over the last 100 years or so of lower Elliott prospecting. And my student, Rick Tolchard, confirmed that indeed these teeth and jaws represent gigantic croc-like predators known as Rawasuchians. Rawasuchians are typical of Triassic deposits worldwide, but they were previously only hypothesized to be present in the lower Elliott Formation. And we've been able to confirm that presence and to expand on it a bit. Some of these fossils certainly represent at least two different Rawasuchian species, here drawn by my former student, Victor Radermacher. And at least one of those species is likely a quadrupedal animal, sort of maybe a slightly slower moving, giant-headed ambush predator, and another represents an active bipedal predator. Now, these Rawasuchians are probably preying on things like Melanorosaurus and Pentosaurus during Triassic lower Elliott times, and moreover, Rawasuchians are yet another Triassic indicator taxon. That is, they go extinct at the end of the Triassic. And so now we have quite good confirmation from two independent lines of biostratigraphic evidence that lower Elliott really does indeed represent the late Triassic. Now, these fossils are nice, but there's some limitations of them. The first limitation is because they were historically collected, we basically have no provenance data on them. We know they're from the lower Elliott, but we don't know where. And that part of the stratigraphy can be up to 200 meters thick or more. So that's not very precise. And of course, the second thing is they're quite fragmentary. I haven't shown you beautiful pictures of specimens because that's simply all we get. And that, of course, is a limitation. Now, in 2016, a colleague of mine stopped by my office and she dumped a pile of fossils on my desk. And she said, I got these from a student at WITS whose dad works in a remote village in the Eastern Cape called Komeha. And I looked at the fossil and I thought, oh, these are potentially interesting. And I called the student's father and I said, next time I'm in the Eastern Cape, I'll pop over and check it out. It turned out that the fossils had been found by a local shepherd, and he knew that they weren't modern things. He knew they were bigger and heavier than a modern animal could be. He had, through an incredibly circuitous route, shown them to a local Jehovah's Witness preacher, a guy named Skinyane Halane, who I think suspended his disbelief somewhat and identified them as potentially belonging to dinosaurs, and then had handed them to this dad of the student. So it's just quite a complicated story. But when we went to inspect these fossils, we were shown outcrop with literally, just dinosaurs falling out of the dongas. Everywhere you look, there was a dinosaur bone either sitting on the side of a cliff, as you can see in the upper left here, or sort of just lying there to be collected. And that site was rapidly popularized in the media as South Africa's dinosaur graveyard. I'm not so sure about the graveyard part of it, but it certainly is the richest lower Elliott locality I've ever seen. And in 2018, I started excavating at Komeha. And so we rapidly were able to move from the discovery phase, like these sort of bones you can see on the upper left, to opening quite large quarries like the one on the upper right, where we've jacketed a skeleton, to sort of understanding that if you're going to put plaster on top of a specimen that big, it's sort of the size of a grand piano case, you need a lot more power to get those plaster jackets out and back into the lab. So you sort of need more power, and you also need nerves of steel, because watching a backhoe flip your precious dinosaur specimen, it turns the intestines to water, I guess I would say politely. So beginning in 2018 and continuing on until just last month, we've been able to really get a whole diversity of specimens from that Komeha site. And many of them, unlike previously collected lower Elliott specimens, are relatively complete, and they tell us a lot more about the biodiversity in Triassic times. One of the initial things that we prepped out actually isn't a dinosaur from Komeha. It's the postcranial skeleton and jaws of this lion-sized mammal relative known as a cynodont. This is a species that we knew about before. It's a thing called Skeleodontoides. And it is known from other places in South Africa, but again, with poor provenance information generally. And Komododomo's Skeleodontoides fossils give us the first glimpse at its postcranial skeleton. That is the anatomy of its vertebrae and of its limb bones. And they really solidify where it sits in the stratigraphy. Other specimens are still coming out of the rocks. This jacket on the upper left, which I showed you before, has now been half prepared. That took about 1,000 hours of prep time. And it represents a nearly complete skeleton of a 2-ton sauropod dinosaur. It's distinct from Melanorosaurus. It's certainly a new species. We have the front half of this animal in a different jacket. It was just too big to take out in a single jacket. And once we flip this specimen and prepare the other side, so another 1,000 hours of work from now, we'll have a really good idea of what it actually is and what part of the dinosaur tree it represents. But it's not only the big stuff from Komodo that's exciting. We've literally got hundreds of fossils now under preparation, and some really fascinating stuff is coming out. There's a little dinosaur skull, the first dinosaur skull from the lower Elliott on the upper left, the partial jaw of another Rawasuchian species on the upper right. The rest of that jaw is still sitting in the rocks waiting for us to remove it. And then along the bottom row are limb bones and postcranial skeletons of literally dozens of other animals, and many of them I can't even identify. I mean, I've actually never seen some of the anatomy that's coming out of this place. So these specimens from Komodo are now yielding a totally different picture of the lower Elliott than what you would get from historical collections. We're getting reasonably complete animals, and we're showing that the lower Elliott does, in fact, have that thriving ecosystem of dinosaurs, dicynodonts, Rawasuchians, croc relatives, all the things that you'd expect from the Triassic, but which simply just weren't present before we found this amazing site. So we are still awaiting our detrital zircon dates from Komodo. We've got a nice sample that goes right up the column, but what we do know is that it sits very close to the bottom of that lower Elliott. So this is something that's quite low down in the Triassic. It might be Norian, could be latest Carnian perhaps. And once we get those dates, we'll have a much better idea of how to compare this new lower Elliott fauna with the faunas of the Triassic of the rest of the world. That's pretty exciting to me. So anyway, one of the main goals of my research group, that is to find more lower Elliott fossils, appears to sort of be well underway. But you've got to watch that space for the publications that will soon be forthcoming. So what about that second part, that let's learn more about the animals of the upper part of the Elliott Formation, the Jurassic part? I love this Maggie Newman illustration. It sort of nicely captures what we know about the Jurassic part of Elliott times. Lots of fossils, lots of species, and when you look on the landscape, 9 things out of 10 are dinosaurs. But that challenge, again, is to flesh these animals out and sort of understand what they did for a living. One of the things that I started when I came to WITS was working on these bones, which were actually discovered by James Kitching and, according to Bruce Rubidge, narrowly missed by Bruce Rubidge, in the early 1990s. They were discovered when they were looking at the sort of pads where they were putting in the mole machines for the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. And so in my first few years at WITS, I finished off excavation at the discovery site of these gigantic bones. And what we found is astounding. So this animal is a sauropodomorph dinosaur. It's one of these things with a long neck and a long tail and a tiny head. And it is absolutely enormous. It's literally impossible for me to sort of give you a sense of scale of this animal without, being there in person. But on the right is a sort of typical sized graduate student, and she is holding the distal end of the femur. That is just the knee of this animal. And you can see that it's pretty much as she can carry. So this animal turned out to be a new species from the upper Elliott, and we named it Ledumahadi mafube, a giant thunderclap at dawn. Ledumahadi was about 12 tons, so it was sort of twice the size of the largest African elephants today. And the really important thing about this animal is that it's quite low in the upper Elliott stratigraphy. It appears very, very close to that extinction boundary. And it tells us that really within less than probably 1,000,000 years after the Earth goes through this catastrophic biodiversity crisis, dinosaurs are able to recover and, in fact, evolve gigantic sizes. And that tells us something about the resilience of dinosaurs, but it also tells us about how fast ecosystems do recover in the wake of mass extinctions. Well, it's not just the Dumahati that's a giant dinosaur from the Upper Elliott. This is just the foot of an animal we discovered near the town of Rhodes, and I'm a bit ashamed to say that we dug this thing out in 2013 and still haven't finished the prep work or the description of the animal. And I know Billy DeClercq is in the audience and probably gritting his teeth about that. But if you just look at the size of the foot of this animal, you know that there are more giant species out there to discover in the Elliott. And so another watch this space. Many of the improvements we've made in sort of fleshing out the animals of the Upper Elliott have really come from what I call better living with radiation. We've been fundamentally assisted in studying these animals by this amazing piece of machinery pictured here in the upper image. This is the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. It's sort of a kilometer-long circuit of electrons, which they torture in various ways with magnets and get to emit X-rays. Those X-rays are tremendously powerful, and they enable us to peer through rocks that contain dinosaur bones and to actually piece together CT scans of those specimens. Each year, the South African National Research Foundation contributes a share of the synchrotron's budget, and in return, we get to travel there with our best material, put it in these X-rays, and image it. That CT imaging has given us the opportunity to reinvestigate many of the older fossils in our collections. So, for example, this skull here, this is the skull of a dinosaur called Massospondylus. It was named by Sir Richard Owen, the guy on the left, in 1854. So this is something we've known about for a long time. But by passing X-rays through the specimen and doing a bit of digital processing, we can actually reconstruct every individual bone of the skull. We can look at the palate. We can look at how these bones contact each other. And in the case of this animal, we can even see the individual bones of the ear. You can see that coming into view now as these little white streaks. And so that ability has really, and here actually we're even showing the balance organs of the skull. So the ability to peer inside those skulls has really changed the level of information we can get out of these historically collected specimens. Another great example are the world's oldest dinosaur embryos. These are baby dinosaurs still in their eggs that were collected by James Kitching in Golden Gate Highlands National Park in the 1970s. And by passing the synchrotron radiation through this specimen, we were able to reconstruct its skull, as I've shown you on the left here, in incredible detail, actually down to almost individual bone cells. And by reconstructing that skull, we could compare it to skulls of animals that are alive today, the closest dinosaur relatives, crocs, chickens, and turtles, shown here on the right. And by looking at the developmental sequences of these modern animals, we can infer that this baby dinosaur, still in its embryo, was about 60% of the way to hatching. That is, it had another 40 days or so to go in the egg before it would have broken the shell and appeared in the outside world. These scans also enabled us to confidently identify this embryo as pertaining to Massospondylus, that is the same animal that Richard Owen described in 1854. And coupled with fieldwork done by Robert Rice and collaborators at WITS in the early 2000s, we can take the data that we have on Massospondylus adult skulls, the data we have on its babies, and these clutches of eggs from the side of the road in Golden Gate Highlands, and piece together the mothering role of Massospondylus laid eggs in the Eastern Free State 200 million years ago in the wake of the End Triassic Extinction, and how many of those babies would have matured into sort of adults that were almost like the impala of South Africa in the Jurassic. Another amazing specimen with which we've used synchrotron radiation to great fact, is this specimen here. This is the skull of the Jurassic ornithischian dinosaur known as Heterodontosaurus. And this specimen came out of a riverbed. In fact, Billy de Klerk excavated this, came out of a riverbed in the Eastern Cape. And I'm going to play a short video of what we were able to do digitally to this specimen. I think it's just amazing. So first, we were able to take the individual slabs of rock that constituted the specimen, and they preserve a nearly complete skeleton. You can see its sort of backbone coming into view now and its feet being added. And we were able to digitally remove that rock, revealing the skeleton inside, which is rotating into your view now. And then we were able to zoom in on interesting parts. In particular, these specialized parts of the rib cage. You can see that this animal has ribs in green coming down, and it also has this strange set of connective bones along the sternum, at the bottom of the ribs, and finally, a series of fine ribs in its belly. Now, these structures are not present in other members of its dinosaurian group, but they are present in some animals alive today, namely crocodilians. And those structures are indicative of a particularly strange mode of breathing. There's no diaphragm like we have, but rather the lungs attach via a muscle to the hip. And by pulling on that muscle, you expand and contract the lungs, allowing the breath to come in and out. Now, that scan of Heterodontosaurus shows us that this was an animal that in the early Jurassic was in transition. It was going from one mode of breathing, a more reptilian mode, if you will, to a highly evolved, novel dinosaurian mode of breathing. And without those scans, we never would have been able to do the fine prep work necessary to understand that sort of 3D anatomy. I have to include this slide as well, just because it's sort of one of my proudest moments as a father. One of the other things we've been able to do in the upper Elliot, in the Jurassic part, is to find a few things that weren't known before. And this is a picture of my daughter Freya in the back of the parking lot of the Golden Gate Highlands National Park Hotel, where we were bored one day on a visit. My wife was at a professional meeting, and we wandered up in the back, and she said, "Dad, what is this?" And what that was a dinosaur tooth. We subsequently found the rest of the skulls sitting on the sandstone, and when we scanned that, we revealed that these crummy little pieces that you can see here actually were full of teeth and were full of bones. And those bones are being reconstructed by one of my students now, and they appear to belong to a carnivorous upper Elliot Jurassic theropod dinosaur, which are basically as rare as hen's teeth. There's 6 total specimens of this type of animal known from all those 1,000 upper Elliot samples. So pretty exciting stuff. So let's get them started young. So let's revisit that beautiful Elliott outcrop. And what I've managed to learn in the last 9 years is that the Triassic lower Elliott, which was formerly sort of depauperate of animals and really hard to necessarily pin down into the global distribution of Triassic faunas, is a lot richer than we once thought. And in fact, we've got this amazing place, Omeha, that's going to continue to yield fossils for the rest of my career that will one day really tell us what that ecosystem looked like. We've also been able to make some inroads into fleshing out the animals of the upper Elliott, reconstructing things like Ledumahati at 12 tons, the role Massospondylus plays in mothering and laying eggs, and even the breathing patterns of some of these animals. And that's been done largely in thanks to advances in radiation and the application of X-rays to specimens. We've also learned that the lower Elliott fauna is typical of the Triassic, and that many of those animals just simply do not persist into the upper Elliott. And so that allows us to be quite confident that this extinction line that we can draw in the Elliott is real. In fact, there are lineages that don't persist. And perhaps some of these advances, like the ability to evolve large body size, or the communal means of nesting of Massospondylus, or the derived breathing of Heterodontosaurus, maybe those are some of the variables that are so important that allow dinosaurs to persist through that extinction event where other groups fail. I want to end with just a couple plugs for some of the more broad impact of this Elliott formation work just on the paleosciences in South Africa. One of the things I'm very concerned about, of course, is that paleo could go extinct as a discipline. It's always an issue because we don't exactly fit into geology, we don't exactly fit into biology, we of course don't fit necessarily into anthropology. But paleontology is so important for understanding the biodiversity of the Earth. And one of the ways I've tried to make sure that paleo doesn't go extinct as a discipline here is by first trying to get students at sort of the second and third year level involved in paleosciences, get them into our department. And we run an annual paleosciences accelerator program where we take top performing second and third years and we show them how great this discipline is. They're pictured on the right here, smiling in the Kirstenbosch Botanical Gardens. And another thing we do is we try to prove to other research groups at WITS and across South African universities that paleo is relevant to them. And this is one of my favorite pictures on the left. These are a group of fine art students actually doing projects using art to express time. And we took these art students out with us in the field, and they actually got their hands dirty, they dug, they experienced time as paleontologists see it, and we learned a lot from them too. Actually, we learned about, how do you convey time, how do you understand what that is to humans, that is non-paleontologist humans, and I think this kind of crossover, art meets science, geology meets biology, is just one of the keys to making sure that paleontology thrives in South Africa. The other way we're keeping paleo from going extinct in South Africa is with the promotion of paleontology through public outreach and public communication of science. I'm very, very pleased to announce that the building is now substantially complete on the Komododomo Dinosaur Interpretive Center in Golden Gate Highlands National Park. An artist's reconstruction of this place is pictured on your right. This is the picture on the left is what it looked like when I went down there sort of 2.5 years ago. But this new museum will tell that story of Massospondylus. It'll tell the story of the embryos and the eggs and the mothers, and also the story of the Elliott Formation in South Africa, that story of the End Triassic Extinction, as well as the ecosystem recovery, and integrate that with existing Basotho legends about Komododomo, this giant dinosaur-like animal that ate up entire villages. That museum will one day look like this. The picture on the top, the exhibit currently looks like this. It's a bit of a shell now, but I think it will finally be open sort of in the middle of next year. And I hope that many of you will be able to make the visit just to see it. And I think that we're going to see many hundreds of thousands of South Africans and foreign tourists alike passing through that museum and absorbing the wisdom of the Elliott Formation. So it's a very exciting time. I want to end today by giving you this picture, which it's always struck me. These are obviously a bunch of barnyard fowl, and what they don't know is that they're staring at a jacket containing the fossils of one of their ancestors from 200 million years ago. And that sort of amazing ability to study dinosaurs and have them relevant to the biodiversity today has always struck me. And I've been very fortunate to be able to do that because of the many funding bodies that have made this possible through WITS ESI and the DSI, through the Center of Excellence in Paleosciences and the NRF, the Royal Society, and PAST. So thank you very much for your attention today. And I'll end the show now, and I'd be very happy to take any of your questions.
Fantastic. I'm sure you're going to get lots of questions. My sort of first comment is credit to you amazing guys and your predecessors and people like yourself and Bruce, and obviously there are lots of others for this, truly remarkable research and collection of information and paleontology that you guys have done. And certainly from, a geological point of view, I think the geologists and a lot of them on the presentation, we seriously need to take note of what the paleontologists have done in this country. And it's a sad indictment of us geologists that we don't, have similar things, museums and that really work to show our remarkable geology. Anyway, that's a pet topic and we'll come back to it. But thanks, and questions, answers, discussion. Who wants to kick off?
John, I want to kick off just by responding to that. And I just want to say that I didn't get to highlight all the work of the geologists involved in this, but There's nothing better than doing paleontology with a few tame sedimentologists in your toolkit to throw at these problems. So while much of the work that I do is biologically focused, obviously from my presentation, the sort of seamless integration of geology and biology has been such a huge part of the success. So absolutely. I hope you didn't take it as an indictment of geology programs. I think it's more of a advertisement for, adding a few biologists to the mix, and you get something much better as a result.
No, absolutely. I agree with you fully, Jonah, and it's another discussion. But, and the soft rock geologists, I think, again, have been sort of leaders, but I'm talking particularly our hard rock geology, where as I say, we'll come back to that another time.
I've got great admiration for paleontologists because I pretended to be one. That's how I got my wife I studied her bones. So you guys, actually kicked off my career. But the question I want for you, Jonah, is how do you go through the process of naming a new species, and who gets to be accredited, and how does that process work?
Yeah, this is quite a good question, actually very topical, because there's recently been some publications working in South Africa. Naming things is really important here, right? As we know from the former Grahamstown and Port Elizabeth and so forth. And I think that extends to species as well. And there's recently been a number of publications kind of criticizing the colonial aspect of naming species in general, and that deep history of, European scientists going to places like Africa, bringing stuff back and naming it after European dudes. So to sort of tackle this in a backwards way, one of the things that I basically promised myself when I started here is that we're trying to give animals discovered in Africa African names. That is, names that reflect something intrinsically interesting about either African language groups or the African landscape. So we've named things like Pulani Sora, the rain lizard, Ledumahadi, and Quebasaurus. It's really important to me to make sure that the names reflect the place, and that can be culture as well as sort of geography. In terms of who gets to select the names, you'd think it's the person who leads the paper, but often it's not. Often a name starts as a vague idea of what you wish to convey, and then everyone involved in the paper or everyone who's at the farm itself where you found the thing pitches in ideas, and you kind of come to a group consensus about what that name is going to be. A very interesting story, at least for me, is about the name Ledumahadi. So we wanted to say this huge animal was like, a giant thunderclap at dawn. I didn't really have the language skills in any African language to express that. And I was out with a guide near Matatiele, a guy who'd been trained to take people out in the field and look at rock art. And I was just telling him about this new dinosaur we'd found. And he sat down with me and just literally said, here's how you might say that in Southern Sutu. Here's how you might say it in Xhosa. Here's how you might say it in Zulu. And basically that guide named the animal. It was more or less entirely his translation ability. And it was just, such a cool thing. I didn't answer your question, though, about, the actual sort of how do you decide this is a new species. I'm happy to review that, Henny, if you'd like.
I was just thinking, in terms of all the species that you found that you haven't even identified yet, do you have to actually pass on so that something is called Choiniere at the end of the day? I'm just curious as to, is it a panel? How do they actually finally decide what the name is?
There's a thing called the International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. It's about the most boring document you'll ever read. It's great if you can't sleep at night. And it actually formalizes the set of rules for how you construct names. It tells you, how many letters must be in a name. It tells you things like, don't name things after yourself, and a variety of other guidelines and rules. And so we have to abide by that ICZN nomenclatural rule book. That's an absolute requirement. In fact, today we have to register names with that international body. It's an online process. You put in the details of your publication, the details of the name. You get a sort of a DOI entry on the ICZN webpage.
How long does the process take? I mean, do you sort of have words that says, look, this one is unnamed, this is John Doe for so long, or does it sort of evolve?
For something like Ledumahadi, right, that specimen was first found by Kitching in the 1990s. He collected a bunch of it. It was prepared over the next 2 decades. We went back and did field work at the original site, found more stuff. That took about 5 years to prepare. It took about 3 years to write the paper and decide, hey, actually by comparing this to other animals, it's definitely distinct. It's its own thing. It has features that we can pinpoint and say these are unique to that animal. And then finally, about a year in review, and I think 5 rejections before it was published ultimately in the journal. So that entire process, that name basically, you could tell it was a new animal almost from day one. I mean, nothing else is that size, but it really took, almost 25 years in that case for the name to become fixed in the literature and for it to be something we could hang a specimen on. So it's often quite time consuming. I mean, I can promise you those fossils from Komeha, we've got a dozen new species minimum already. By the time the last of those comes out, I think that I will already be eyeing retirement with a much more critical eye, I guess I would say.
John and Jonah, it's Bruce here. Thank you for a really exciting talk. I think your work is wonderful, and such a broad, multidisciplinary attitude is wonderful. Just for my own edification and understanding of dinosaur history in South Africa, you said that Skeleodontosaurus was the first discovered dinosaur in South Africa. I thought that it was a Massaspondylus specimen from Harry Smith.
You're absolutely correct, Bruce. So I misspoke when I said that. So Massaspondylus was described in 1854, and Huxley's publication on Skeleodontosaurus was 1866. So yeah, Massaspondylus beats Skeleodontosaurus by about 12 years. The actual date of the discovery of that Massaspondylus specimen from Harry Smith, I'm not sure. That what happened is those fossils were sent to the British Museum and they just sat there. You know quite well how this goes. You collect a jacket and 10 years later, you finally have the time to prepare it. I don't know how long H Brown's material sat around in crates either before it was studied. But yeah, Massaspondylus definitely is the first dinosaur named from the Elliott formation. But Billy's probably about to jump in here and correct me. The first dinosaur named from South Africa, it was actually named in the 1840s. It's Pteranodon. And that specimen it's from the Eastern Cape. It's from a game farm not that far from Grahamstown.
Yeah, thank you. Now, that's the one question. The other is on your family tree over there, you showed the pterosaurs made it through the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Why have your team not found any pterosaurs yet?
That is an excellent question. Most of the global pterosaur record is from lacustrine deposits. These pterosaurs are a lot like birds in many ways. The bones are extremely hollow. And you can imagine that many of them die and become fossils by literally plummeting out of the air, nose diving into sediments at the bottom of a lake and getting preserved that way. A lot of the deposits that we're looking at, a lot of the strata are they're not lacustrine, they're not fine grained enough to preserve those delicate animals. My predecessor, Adam, thought he had some pterosaur material from Heelbo Farm near Sianakal in the Free State. And that material hasn't shown to be pterosaur. That said, one of the quarries, which I didn't show you at Komeha, is a fine-grained, almost clay-like sort of quarry. The animals there include some really, really small stuff. I mean, some almost microvertebrate material. I think, in terms of our best chance at finding a Triassic pterosaur, it might be these Komeha deposits. And hopefully the next few years of excavation will turn one up. They should be there. They should definitely be there.
I must congratulate you on a wonderful talk. As a museum curator, when I first started to unpack the collection at the Albany Museum in Grahamstown in, 40 years ago, I had nothing to work with in terms of taxonomy in the upper and lower Elliot, up in the Elliot formation. So anything large, any bone fossil material that was in the collection or had been brought in by a local farmer, all of that stuff just seemed to land up in the catch-all basket of Skeleodontosaurus. It was a rather frustrating because one could see that there was a different material, different animals within that general collection. And with your taxonomic work that you're doing with your students, you've created this wonderful framework onto which we can hang all these new fossils that are old and potentially new. It's really a fantastic framework that you've put together, and I must congratulate you and your team on achieving this. What was really remarkable was the fact that you're still getting Dinosaurs way up in the upper lower Elliot. That to me is quite remarkable, but fantastic job.
Thanks very much, Billy. And I should tell everyone in the audience that between Billy and Bruce, both these guys, when I started at Wits, more or less took me under their wing and drove me around and said, you should look here, you should look here, you should look here for dinosaurs. And pretty much everywhere they pointed, we found stuff, So it's really, thanks to you guys' great mentorship that this has blossomed into such a successful program with so many students. So, forever grateful for that. I should tell you, Billy, that interestingly, we've now got a Rawasuchian from the Upper Elliott Formation. It's from the very, very base of the Upper Elliott Formation. And it actually, I didn't want to tell you about it because it throws the story a little bit on its head. The dating suggests that maybe that bottom smidgen of the Upper Elliott Formation might in fact be Triassic as well. And it might be really pushing up against that extinction boundary. And I think as we flesh that story out, we're going to really have quite high precision on when the End Triassic extinction appears on land. But like you said, it's really due to not assuming, hey, this must be from the Lower Elliott because it's X. Right? It's about saying, I'm going to find where that sits on the strat column, and then I'm going to do everything I can to get a date out of that and test those hypotheses.
There's an interesting question about, the removal of specimens and how they get handled, and how that work. And it's great to see what you and Bruce are doing, with the Golden Gate Museum, and then Bruce's stuff down in the Karoo, so that stuff has been wonderfully preserved and presented. But and you showed again the interaction, with non-geological or paleontological students. But what is the sort of chapter and verse when it comes to handling fossils, removing fossils, how do you preserve that quarry, for example, and how do you make sure you can keep going back to it? Maybe you've got some comments on that.
This is actually kind of a can of worms discussion, because we have this obligation to let's say the South African taxpayer, the people who fund the NRF, to take these fossils and care for them in perpetuity. Now that's the deal we sign. As soon as I scratch my first bit of dirt around a fossil, I've more or less signed a contract that says I'm going to see through that this thing is cared for, hand it off to the next generation, and tell them you take care of it or else. And that's a pretty big responsibility. I think there's been a lot of progress in archival methods in the last 20 years or so. And so now we're using a variety of glues and so forth that are fully reversible. There are things that we know will last 100 years in collections, and we've characterized them chemically quite well. And so that's part of that commitment. I've got a visiting Fulbright scholar from the US in our collections now. He's working on stuff, and he's just been saying, how great it is to see how well organized much of the collection is. And if you go worldwide, you don't always see that. And so South Africa's got this quite good history of documenting the information about the fossils. That is, not only caring for the fossil itself, but preserving its metadata, where it's from, who found it, what are the circumstances of its discovery. And that's something that almost every museum in the country is doing a pretty good job of with their Karoo age collections. And that's a testament to the generation that came before me, realizing how important those data would be. Then there's this issue of how do we take these specimens and present the scientifically interested public? We can't just lock them away in the basement, because these are national treasures, right? And the citizens of the country deserve to see those treasures. And not only that, we should use them to leverage things like tourism, community development, and so forth. That's a conversation where we don't know the answer to it yet. I think museums like the Golden Gate Highlands National Park, the Dinosaur Interpretive Center, like Kitching Fossil Exploration Center, like what Bruce is doing now in Crawford-Net, they're a step in the right direction. And I do think that, there's a lot of room still for South African museum culture to grow. In terms of how do we take these specimens out of the basements and get them to people so that they can appreciate them. I think we're not fully there yet. And then the last part of this conversation is about how do we not leave the community out of it? Because I go down to Kameha, it's a village of about 1,500 people, something like that. It's a poorly developed rural area. They've found this amazing thing, truly, fundamentally changing science. How do we make sure they get something good out of it? How do we make sure that we don't take their stuff and stow it in our basement and walk away and say, thank you very much. We'll see you 10 years from now when we want to dig again. And one of the ways that we've started this year working on that situation is we had a massive outreach initiative in Kameha village at the local school where we brought in a group called Play Africa, and they designed a series of small interactive exhibits using the lessons learned from the Comeha dinosaurs to convey science, to convey STEM discipline stuff to early learners, kids from ages 5 to about 12. And that exhibit included things, like casts of their dinosaurs, books about African dinosaurs, and then just a variety of fun stuff that shows kids what it's like to be a paleontologist. There was a dig pit, there was a puzzle where you have to take a skeleton and reassemble it. And ultimately, what we'd like to do there is to actually get those exhibits into a community center and to distribute those kinds of exhibits as teaching modules to every school in the area. And that's something that we're scaling up slowly. It's a big commitment, hey? When you first put your pick into the ground around a fossil, you end up touching a lot more aspects of the country's educational system and museum system than you ever expect.
Jonah, can I ask you, this concentration of fossils you found, was that fortuitous, just an outcrop, or can we assume that the same density of species were distributed right throughout the Elliott period, or was there some local climate that concentrated the animals in that area?
This is a good question, and this is the sort of conversation we have almost every night when we're in the field at this spot, because I've gone through countless kilometers of lower Elliott outcrop and just found nothing, basically, just dirt. So the short answer is I don't yet know. And we've got Emma Shabordi, Rob Muir, Lara Shishio, and Pia Viglietti, and a woman named Selena Suarez from the University of Arkansas, all trying to figure out how those deposits got laid there, what's the taphonomy of the animals, that is, how did they come to die in those spots, and whether or not that actually represents something special. Maybe we're at just the right part of a meandering river system or something like that. But the short answer is I don't know. What I should say is that that particular part of South Africa has been poorly explored. And by assembling that biostratigraphic database, which I showed you just a snapshot of, you can see areas where there's Elliott outcrop mapped, but where for some historical reasons, maybe it's former Transkei, was difficult to access, researchers haven't gone. And I think that, Comeha is one of those places. It's like got a pile of outcrop mapped and exactly 0 collections records historically. While 100 kilometers away in Lady Grey, there's dozens of localities. So I think, part of it is also saying, well, where haven't people been? Where is there promising outcrop, but people haven't set foot? And that, if we're to systematically kind of check off that kind of place, we might find that this sort of rich deposit is more common than we think. I can tell you one piece of data that kind of verifies that is, before we started in Comeha, we were going up to the Telly Bridge crossing into Lesotho, which isn't that far away. It's sort of Barkley East area, taking rural roads. And we drove through a village with just beautiful upper Elliott exposures. And literally every single spot we stopped and said, well, let's check this outcrop, we found a skeleton worth excavating. I mean, I've got like a priority list of these things. And so that isn't lower Elliott formation, but it's a tremendously rich area of the upper Elliott, also just not on the maps. So I think there are more out there. That's what I think. Another place that I recently looked is if you know where, if you've ever been down to Maclear and you drive towards Mount Fletcher from there, there's a bunch of sort of narrow valleys extending up into like the Kacha's Neck area, just before you get to Sani Pass. And those had never been looked at for fossils either. And we just had a 5-day sort of recce there, and also once again found specimens everywhere. I think a bit of it is going to areas that historically have been under prospected. And maybe a bit of it is good luck, and a bit of it is kind of getting the word out so a shepherd in some rural community knows to give me a call when they do find something.
Fantastic. Interestingly, I mean, it's interesting you talk about that Triassic extinction, End Triassic extinction, and sort of ascribe it to flood basalt volcanism or volcanism. And yet we see the dinosaurs, that lived or sort of appeared after that so-called extinction. And yes, it is an extinction. But then we had, these massive, call them Karoo, basalt outpourings, 182 million years, and those were followed, and those were super extensive across Gondwana, South Africa, if we go around South Africa, and many of our kimberlites, our young kimberlites, we find xenoliths of Karoo basalt. So, you know, the places we don't find Karoo basalt, like in the middle of the Free State, they were probably there was a carapace there as well. After that, you had the Edendeka, the younger sort of 130 million year old basalt outpouring across through into the Paraná. So again, there was a huge volcanic outpouring and everything that went with it, you know, lots of heat and ash and dust and gas. And yet those dinosaurs supposedly lived through to the end Cretaceous, you know, when they all went missing and disappeared. How do you, as a paleontologist, sort of rationalize, you know, those end members, but with this huge, equally, you know, impressive volcanic outpouring through that period, but yet these animals were scurrying around and still living?
This is a really good question as well. So, I mean, one of the things is with the Karoo-Farrar lip, right? The that's sort of about the Toarcian period in the Jurassic, and I mean, if you think the lower Elliott is undersampled for fossils, try to find dinosaurs in the Toarcian worldwide. It's just probably one of the worst understood time intervals in the dinosaur area. What I think we know from the marine record is there is a pretty significant extinction in the marine realm associated with the Karoo-Farrar large igneous province. I would just say at this point, we just don't have the data necessary to understand, does it affect life on land, you know, particularly dinosaurs in the same way. I wouldn't stake my career on any guess about that. But for these other large igneous provinces, it is curious. And you just wonder, is there some intrinsic thing in the dinosaur lineage that they've inherited, passing through a couple of these big, you know, flood basalt events that makes them resilient to it? I don't know what, and I just touched on this. I didn't have time to go into depth on it. Is that dinosaur breathing is really interesting, and birds today, you know, as our sole living dinosaur lineage, birds breathe completely differently from the way we do. I mean, their lungs don't move, for example. Their lungs are like a radiator that they just pass air over using air sacs in their body, and they're up to 4 times as efficient as mammals are at extracting oxygen from the air. That sort of breathing, it's not just birds, it actually goes way, way back in the dinosaur lineage to the ancestors of both meat-eating dinosaurs, theropods, and things like Massospondylus. And then as you see with Heterodontosaurus, it evolves its own unique way of breathing that's different from other dinosaurs, but it's similarly like, you know, it's clearly evolutionarily important for that lineage. And I suspect that maybe breathing and its like downstream correlates, things like metabolism, how fast you can process oxygen, how good you are at extracting nutrients from food. I think that those things, they must have something to do with it. And they must differ significantly from the croc, the croc side of the tree, in ways that made dinosaurs simply, you know, better at passing through those events. That said, today's crocodilians are the descendants of a lineage that somehow, by hook or by crook, made it through every single one of those lips, didn't have the same breathing adaptations as dinosaurs, and you know they're reasonably diverse today. Anyway, I mean that's kind of my fire your guns all off at once answer to your question.
Thanks. So let's see what's happened. Let's see what happens and what lives through the next imminent extinction.
There's a question in the text column. Can you see that?
I can. I was in fact going to ask if I could answer it now, because it's always nice when you can say, yes, we thought of that. So the question is, are 3D scanners used at all in and when making these excavations? And you know, it should be a great way for preserving locality data and as a tool for training. It's a really good suggestion. And I'm happy to say that we actually are now doing that. So every year now, when I go out in the field, I take a high quality SLR camera with me, and we make 3D models using a tool called photogrammetry, which many of you have probably used already. You simply walk around a specimen and take a bunch of pictures at different angles, feed them into this software, and it gives you a high resolution 3D model of that site. And so we can use that photogrammetry technique to literally make 3D models of the quarries as we're excavating. We can document bones as they come out of the quarries. We can document things like footprint sites, which are notoriously difficult to bring back to the lab and study. And it's really changed the way we do fieldwork, I would say. The other thing that we're doing is with drones. So I have a student, Gavin Dolman, who's at the University of the Free State, and he took a drone and he flew that entire Kameha village exposure. It's actually huge, and I didn't get to tell you there's many different quarries scattered over several square kilometers. But he flew a drone over that thing about 80 meters high, and he took like, I don't know, several thousand pictures. It may have been in the tens of thousands of pictures. And he managed to stitch them together into a 3D model of the landscape that's accurate to a centimeter. So you can pick out individual pebbles on the surface in this 3D model, which of course you can't open on a normal computer because it's so big. But that model, then he was able to use AI. So he did some programming in AI, and he can classify areas that are likely to produce fossils using that AI model. He can do things like map donga systems. He can map erosion in real time. So he can fly that drone, make a model, say, here are the erosional surfaces, fly it a year later, compare it to the previous model and say, here's how much erosion has occurred in that time interval. I mean, it's just amazing. And then if you couple that with the satellite imagery that we have for the site, we've been working on sort of, taking that 2,000 square kilometers of Elliott outcrop, which I'll never be able to visit all of myself. I mean, it's just, physically impossible. And using both drone imagery and satellite imagery to narrow it down to just what we think are the absolute best places, the places that we must go and look because it's most likely there'll be fossils coming out of the ground there. So that 3D technology, photogrammetry, remote sensing, that kind of stuff, drone work, it's just changing the way we do field work. And I think we're only going to see more of that occurring in the future of paleontology.
Good, and maybe next ground penetrating radar as well and stuff like that.
Yeah, currently, it's quite good at finding things like fossil logs. And if you're a really huge sauropodomorph, like something the size of the Dumahati, you could probably pick that up. It's not yet to the precision level we need to find, little mammal skulls or something, but it sure would be nice.
Yeah.
You mentioned with that work of yours and Kimi's on those Masspondylus embryos that yours is about 60% through in its, call it, hatching period. And then you threw away that the total hatching period would have been about 100 days. How do you get that sort of figure, that sort of 3 months?
We're back figuring from what we know about the development time in turtles, crocs, and birds. Birds are really fast, right? A chicken's about 30 days, 24 days, something like that. A turtle's about 80 days, and a croc is about 100 days. And so we did some quite shady back of the envelope phylogenetically corrected calculations and suggest 100 days. A real answer is we're not quite sure yet. And what Kimi's now doing is scanning those teeth. There's actually teeth in those skulls. They're very, very tiny, and you don't see them at the resolution I showed you. In my video didn't work, or you would have seen them. But the teeth actually preserve a line of dentin for every day that tooth has been growing in its socket. And so if you can get down to sort of the submicron level, you can see the lines of dentin, and you can literally count the age of a tooth by its rings. And so Kimi's been now working in New York to see if she can do that. And then you can say, okay, well, this tooth is this old, so the embryo must be at least X many days old. And that would give us a more precise estimate.
Thank you.
I assume you collect plant fossils as well.
This is actually one of the major problems in dinosaur paleontology. And a friend of mine, Paul Barrett, who's at the Natural History Museum in London, he once had a grant to study the interactions between dinosaurs and plants. And what he found was he could find about a handful of deposits worldwide where there's good plant fossils adjacent to dinosaur fossils. It just very seldom happens for some reason. Recently, we excavated a dinosaur near the town of Dordrecht, and it was in the side of a dam. It was basically in a clay bed in the side of this farmer's dam. And when the drought was worst there, he said, "Hey, there's a dinosaur coming out of my dam." So we call this thing the dam dino. And we got in there, lickety split, and dug the thing out. And what was fascinating is over this skeleton of this dinosaur was basically a carpet of leaves. It's a thing called Teniopterus, which is about all I know about it. But this dinosaur, literally, the skeleton must have washed into an eddy or a lag or something like that, and then just gotten a last dump of leaves. on top of it. So when we do find plant fossils like that, we get incredibly excited about them, and we're working on them now. Hopefully they'll be in the queue for publication in early 2022. But it is a very, very rare event.
Fascinating. Zeni, then do you want to wrap up?
Thank you very much for an extremely well presented one. I think this one you can take off the shelf and show it even to kids, and it will actually motivate them to become paleontologists. You did a very good job of this. Thanks, Jonah.